Yeah, but I do have this abiding interest in waste and waste streams and where things come from, and yeah, so I had written about sanitation in the garbage book, wondering where things go after they leave our homes, and that did include sewage.
But I'm assuming it's not just a fascination with things that we don't like to think about, but it has to do with their effects on the planet.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah.
And that you think people should be talking and learning about.
Right, they're important matters that we tend to not look at, so that's I guess my niche. Yeah.
Well, Stephen, I think we'll come to you next. Because I mean, obviously, you guys all write about environmental issues to one extent or another, or you wouldn't be here on the fellowship. But Stephen, I know you've written about wildfire and wolves and trout and global warming and all sorts of things. Do you feel drawn to? What is it that draws you to those topics? What makes you want to be a journalist?
Well, I don't know if I was particularly drawn to anyone. I guess honestly, it's I like when things don't make sense. Like I like a little bit of I'm drawn to hypocrisy. I've kind of figured that out. It's something this fellowship has given me a chance to do. Is why do I like to write about this stuff? And I keep finding this thread, whether it's trout or wildfires or something else. I like it when our understanding of a thing doesn't really jive with the reality of the thing. And that usually tells me that there's something else going on there. That there's a perception, a cultural perception, or a press media perception that is maybe it's intentional, that it's just trying to get everyone to think this thing, socialism, or maybe it's something that just kind of happens because of the way we view stuff. But I think there's often an interesting story there. So when things don't jive, I kind of like that.
Well, you freelance, but also, I guess most recently your full-time job was this managing editor of Yes Magazine.
I was a senior editor.
Senior editor, which its tagline is "Journalism for People Building a Better World." So does that match with sort of your philosophy? Are you trying to build a better world?
Yeah,
obviously we all want a better world.
Right. I'm not a big tagline person. I think that
too much hypocrisy.
I think, it kind of sets it up, right? I think the five of us here would say that's what we do. I think as a journalist, that's a big part of what you do. Is you hope that you're informing people, and there's nothing more powerful, and nothing makes a stronger cement for a better world than information. And so I think, I do think that Yes Magazine, its intent is and has been for 20-some years to provide people with positive stories about solutions that are happening in the world, because so much of our coverage is constantly about the things that are going wrong. And I kind of tend to come at the world from a perspective of what is going wrong. Let's figure that out and then fix it. And Yes is about, let's focus on the things that were good. And so I wasn't there for decades or anything, but I was there for a few years, and that rubbed off on me. So I would say the solutions angle of things, that perspective of from time to time you've got to give people something positive. I would say I'm trying to build a better world with journalism. Sometimes I do that from a very critical, cynical even angle, but I think that's ultimately my goal.
And Peter Brannen, a lot of your reporting deals with things from long, long ago. You're interested in really big philosophical questions, alien life, but particularly about life on Earth and extinction on Earth. And actually, I was just, the Boulder bookstore had your book on the bestseller shelf the other day. So
that's not true. But
no, it's true.
It was on the shelf, but it's not a bestseller.
They ordered too many copies, so they're trying to get rid of it.
Is it signed?
No, I'll get it signed. But you're recently out in paperback, still new book, The Ends of the World, which is just a wonderful read about mass extinctions in the world's ancient past and what they teach us about what might be our bleak future. But what is it about geology? What is it you're trying to say with the kind of writing that you do?
So I guess I noticed that, so where to start? When we hear about climate change, it's usually presented as this thing that happens in computer models, and it's theoretical, and it happens in the future. And half the story is the fact that the planet's run this experiment for a lot in Earth's past. And we actually calibrate our models to see if they can reproduce these past warming events in Earth's past. And they basically can't. So whenever you read the IPCC or anything like that, there's always these caveats about how these projections might be too conservative, because when you look in Earth's past, when you see this much carbon goes into the air, the Earth responds in these really dramatic ways. And so I just thought there's this whole like half of the climate story that is sort of undercovered, where the Earth seems to respond in these dramatic ways, but you also, it's this sort of Trojan horse way of introducing people to climate change, where people are interested in fossils and all these alien worlds that are sort of these sci-fi worlds in Earth's past, and you can sort of sneak this climate message in that is just as frightening as, you know, whatever the latest computer model spits out, because we can see that if you inject tons of CO2 into the ocean atmosphere system all at once, ocean chemistry changes in a way that's really devastating to life, and for each 1 degree Celsius you go up in geological record, it's something like 20 meters of sea level rise. So that's kind of crazy. You know, some of the most ambitious climate plans that you hear of is like, oh, we'll stabilize around 500 parts per million by the end of the century. That brings you back to around 16 million years ago when sea level was like 130 feet higher. And it's just this totally alien world. So we're giving the planet this giant kick that to me is sort of interesting just from a science perspective, from an experimental perspective. Like I regret that I'm not going to live long enough to see how this all plays out, to see which model's correct. But
so is it it's just fascinating, you want to learn about it? Is that what gets you excited, or is it that you're trying to shout from the rooftops that we've got to change our ways?
I think mostly now it's that I'm fascinated. I definitely got into it because I was terrified. I did a week-long program for science journalists at Woods Hole like 8 or 9 years ago, where everyone there was talking about ocean acidification, which I had sort of heard about before, but people there seemed to be terrified of it. And by the end of the week, I was terrified too. And some of the people were talking about this event called the PETM, which was 56 million years ago, where about the same amount of CO2 that we're putting into the air now, the Earth spat into the air through volcanoes burning through fossil fuel reserves. And it was over 20,000 years versus like a century. And it was this huge disruption to life and the climate. I just think that the more you grapple with Earth history, sort of the crazier the experiment that we're running now seems.
Well, I like what you said about kind of sneaking in the climate change message, and that's one of the things that gets me most excited about science journalism is finding a way to take really arcane or topics people don't think they're interested in, and sneak in the science when they're not looking with storytelling. And is that sort of the way you guys think about it too?
I definitely did that. When I first moved to Boulder back in 2002, I was starting to write about environmental issues, but I had all these editors in New York who were not the editors of science sections or environment, anything. And so I would try to do that. So like I was writing for the House and Home section of the New York Times back when I lived in New York. And when I moved out here, my editor was like, oh, I want some, pitch me kooky stories about those wacky people out west. And so, because he's like sitting in his office in New York City and thinks that like living in Colorado is completely bizarre. But so I did. And so I did all these stories I did a story about drought and how people were coping with drought around their homes and gardens in Colorado. And, so it was just a house and home story, but it was really an environmental story about drought. And I did some stories about green building that were sort of, they were kind of like home decor stories, but it was when people were starting to first use kind of like salvaged materials and deconstruct buildings instead of, smashing them down and, recycling materials. And so those stories were sort of, they were these home stories, but I thought of them as Trojan horse stories also.
So Trojan horse for your editor.
Yeah.
And I guess
for readers too. Also who just, they're like, oh, great, this is a nice light home and garden story, but really it's an environment story.
Well, I was told, like, when I was trying to pitch my book, that people's eyes just glaze over when they see climate change. And so,
well, I guess it's not in your title or subtitle.
No, I mean, it was taken out of the subtitle.
Was it originally in there?
Yeah, I think so. But they're just like, climate change books don't sell, even though David Wells is like disproving that at the moment. But yeah, so for them, they were excited to have this sort of, people love hearing about dinosaurs and stuff like that. And if you can package a climate change story with that overarching narrative, and it was helpful.
Now, I mean, one of the other great things about being a journalist is getting access to people and places that a lot of folks don't normally get to go. I mean, you were off in India for your defecation story. That's exciting. And Hillary, I think I saw a picture of you with an orangutan, I assume when you were in Indonesia recently. I mean, how much is that part of, you were up in Alaska doing a piece not long ago? I mean, way out there in Alaska.
Yep, just, well, up in Kotzebue. And in some of the native villages outside Kotzebue. So yeah, up inside the Arctic Circle, looking at the ice breakup and the timing of the breakup and how folks were faring in that area.
So, I mean, this is like way out toward Russia, right?
On the Chukchi Sea, kind of. You could see Russia from there.
So do you, I mean, is that travel as exciting as it would seem to most people?
Oh my God, yes. I mean, why else would you do it? You know, like,
Right.
just,
To me,
I mean,
it's not like so much. Sorry. Go ahead.
well, I once had a job working as an editor of a small-time paper in downtown Seattle. And we were covering gentrification, and we were covering just like the regular mom and pop stores opening and closing and all those types of things around Seattle. And I was constantly trying to pitch stories about water and trees and stuff that just didn't matter to that readership at that time in that framework. And at one point I was doing an interview with like a water manager, asking him about what's wrong with the water in Seattle. I was like, well, nothing. It's actually quite nice. And it's like, damn it, and why? And I realized I don't want to be doing this. I want to be out. I want to be outside. I want to be out in the world seeing things. And
Yes.
journalism, for all of its many pitfalls and how much it can stress you out and make you grind your teeth at night, at the end of the day, it's a great way to get out, to go on a vacation.
I like to say we're professionally nosy.
Professionally nosy, yeah.
Yeah.
It gives you license to call people and they
Yup.
call you back.
Yup.
If you're writing for a publication they've heard of.
Yes.
Like, so the travel is great for me, but at this point, it's not the primary thing, but just
You've been
being.
everywhere.
No, I haven't been everywhere. But that the license you can find out, and you have a reason, a motivation, and people get back to you and they want to tell you. Well, some of them want to tell you what's going on, but
Yeah.
they want to be in print.
No, I remember when I left college and I was working for public radio in Boston doing science reporting, I was astonished. I would call these Nobel Prize winners and they would get back to me and I
Yeah.
would
There you
meet with
go.
them, and it really is kind of intoxicating.
Yeah.
It makes you think you're more important than you are,
Yeah.
actually.
But I have to say, that's actually one of the things that I love most about covering science, because I briefly had dabbled in business journalism, not by choice, but at some point early on in my career, I was covering business. And you're constantly calling these people and you have to there's all these layers of PR people, and they're talking marketing speak, and they're trying to they're very opaque, and their whole goal is to not actually tell you what's really going on. And then I started interviewing scientists, and I was like, oh my God, these people actually
better
want
source.
to tell me stuff, and they're happy to talk to me. And okay, they're using their own kind of jargon,
Yeah.
but it wasn't.
Right.
It wasn't. They weren't trying to obscure things with
No.
it. It was just that they didn't know how else to talk.
Unintentional.
Yeah.
No one else did.
No, I know. I mean, I hate
Very
covering
true.
politics because people, you can't trust what anyone
Yeah.
says. And I do love with scientists how I've found, you can ask them, okay, who disagrees with you? And they'll tell you, oh, geez, you need to talk to this person, who's my biggest critic. Of course, they'll say that person's wrong, but they're happy for you to talk
Yeah.
to them, which really seems to be different.
Yeah, it is sort of it almost shouldn't have the same name as investigative journalist. Journalists shouldn't
Yeah.
cover both the two jobs. Because I remember working for a small newspaper in Massachusetts where the town administrator was being investigated by the attorney general, and I was writing all these damning articles about him, and I'd have to see him in the local YMCA gym locker room. And it was just this horribly awkward experience that now that I'm walking into some geologist's office who no one's ever asked him why he studies what he does, and they're so eager to talk to you. It's sort of
Yeah.
a totally different
For sure.
experience, which isn't to say we should be total just
Quarters.
yeah, right, unskeptical.
Right.
No, but there's I think it's a different attitude in the
Yeah,
science.
yeah.
Yeah. Although
We're sort of pulling in the same direction towards explaining, or at least in science journalism, maybe why the world works the way it does, I guess. Although with environmental journalism, you can certainly get into some really thorny issues, especially with the stuff you guys write about with water rights and stuff like that.
Well, I mean, Chris, although you've covered all sorts of stuff.
Yes.
With your time at CNN. I
Yes.
mean, stuff that's like